at the end.
Okay, so it started recording. So, hello everyone to this final MS thesis talk of this year. So today we have Sankalp Chaudhary, who just graduated with his BSMS. He did his final year project in astronomy and astrophysics, and he worked on the modeling radio observations of the Sonia-Zeldovich effect in galaxy clusters. He did it under Professor Yvette Perrot at the University of Canterbury, Wellington, and he will also talk about his other projects in the end, which would be interesting. So hang around. So yeah, you can start.
All right. So the slides are visible, right? Hello?
Yep.
Good. So hello everyone. I will present my fifth year project on modeling radio interferometric observations of the Sonia-Zeldovich effect signal from clusters of galaxies. I was supervised by Dr. Yvette Perrot. Clusters of galaxies are a collection of hundreds of galaxies containing hot gas or plasma filling the space between these galaxies. Their mass is between 10 raised to 14 to 10 raised to 15 solar masses, and their extent ranges from 1 to 5 megaparsec. They are composed of 85% dark matter, 12% diffused ionized hot gas or plasma, and 3% are stars and galaxies. The temperature is between 10 raised to 7 and 10 raised to 8 Kelvin, and the density is 1 particle per 1,000 cubic centimeter volume. Figure on the right is a composite image of Abell 2384 with X-rays from Chandra and XMM Newton, which is in blue, and radio emission from Giant Meter Wave Radio Telescope in red or magenta here, and optical data from the Digitized Sky Survey, which is in yellow or white here. Sonia-Zeldovich effect is the distortion of the cosmic microwave background as high energy electrons from the hot gas or plasma in the intracluster medium, upon collision with the low energy CMB photons, upscatter the photons following the fundamental mechanism of inverse Compton scattering. So you might have heard about Compton scattering. It's the inverse process of this. So in this figure, a CMB photon in red enters the hot ICM, which is gray or light blue in color, from an arbitrary angle. And this, the trajectory of the electron is shown here in with the black arrow, and it upscatters the CMB photon to a higher energy, shown here in blue. And this is what gives rise to the thermal Sonia-Zeldovich effect. The total momentum in the interaction is conserved, so the electron is largely undeflected by the interaction. Since it is a distortion in the CMB radiation, the Sonia-Zeldovich effect signal is in the radio or sub-millimeter waveband. So the observed Sonia-Zeldovich brightness, delta I sub nu, in the direction of an electron reservoir, which populates the intracluster medium of these clusters, is given by equation 1, where B sub nu is the black body spectrum, T is the temperature, and f of nu is the frequency dependence of the TSZ signal, while T sub E is the temperature of scattering electrons, and the function delta takes into account relativistic corrections. The dimensionless parameter y, known as the Comptonization parameter, is the integral of the number of collisions times the mean fractional energy change of photons per collision along the line of sight. And it's given here in equation 2. Here, P sub E of R is the electron pressure at distance R from the center of the cluster. Sigma sub T is the Thomson scattering cross-section. And the integral y subtot of the Comptonization y parameter over the solid angle omega subtended by the cluster is proportional to the volume integral of the gas pressure. It is therefore a good estimate of the total thermal energy content of the cluster and hence its mass. Once the pressure profile and the geometry of a cluster are known, its mass profile can be calculated. So this work was done on ALMA data downloaded from here with this project code. These galaxy clusters were selected from the massive and distant clusters of WISE survey, in short MATCOWS. which provides a catalog of high redshift infrared selected clusters of galaxies observed by the Wide Field Infrared Survey Explorer. The frequency range of these observations was from 90.5 to 104.5 gigahertz. So here's a picture of the Atacama Compact Array in the Atacama Desert in northern Chile. So it's a subset of the antennae in ALMA. The only takeaway I want you to have from this plot is that, so this dotted line is the CMB spectrum, which is the closest you can get to a perfect black body. And the plot in yellow is the thermal Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect. And if you see that in the frequency range of our observations, around 100 gigahertz, the TSZ signal is actually negative. That means the thermal Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect is a decrement in the CMB spectrum that we observe. So this is the flowchart outlining the data processing steps. In the interest of time, I will not go into the detail of every step here, but if you're interested, you can ask about it at the end of the talk. So while we're working with these data, we have to be sure that our data is not contaminated by artificial sources, say satellites launched by humans. So we plot the amplitude against time, frequency, and UV wave to look for any unexpected spikes that can be attributed to any such satellites. So UV wave is actually the projected baseline separation in units of the observing wavelength. So what these antennae actually capture are visibilities, which is the Fourier transform of the true intensity sky brightness distribution. So the UV wave is like a distance, but in the UV plane in which the antennae are capturing these signals. So again, the clean task inverse Fourier transforms and deconvolves these images from visibilities, so as to we can understand in which direction how this object looks. So regions with the highest signal in the map were masked, and the image was subjected to cleaning till everything in the map looks like noise. So here is the dirty image and the residual image after cleaning. The model chosen to fit the data is a purely observational generalized Navarro-Frank White model. So P sub E of R is the same as introduced in equation 2, and P sub naught is an overall normalization coefficient. R sub S is the scale or characteristic radius of the cluster. So this model operates in three regimes. One is inside the cluster, one at the boundary of the cluster, and one outside the cluster. So the GNFW profile is an empirical model that describes the spatial distribution of gas pressure in galaxy clusters without necessarily linking it to physical quantities, but it is possible to link them. So yeah, this is a text-heavy slide. The code MacAdam samples the parameter space of a given cluster model utilizing the multiness sampling algorithm. Adopting this, we obtain posterior inferences of cluster parameters such as position, the right ascension and declination, the extent, and the Comptonization Y parameter, etc. The first cluster run is a run that includes all the cluster parameters. The null run with the suffix capital N is a cluster run with the Comptonization Y parameter set to 0. That is, no cluster is considered to be present. Everything else kept the same. So for two models, A and B, the log evidence of A minus log evidence of B is the strength of model A with respect to model B. So the log evidence difference between the first cluster run and the null run gives the strength of cluster detection, indicating how many times it is more or less likely to find a cluster than if no cluster is considered to be present. So the threshold we had for this log evidence difference for model selection was 1. So if LE of A minus LE of B is greater than or equal to 1, we can say that LE of A is more significant than LE of B, and we reject B and go for model A. So while we focus on the intracluster medium of galaxy clusters, we might come across emission from foreground and background galaxies in the field of view. that contaminate the reconstruction of the cluster model from observational data. To account for this, we perform source searches and remove the identified sources from the maps. So the blind search searches for K2 potential point-like sources. So the suffix is BK sub 2 over the field of view of the map with 4 variable parameters, namely the right ascension declination, the central flux density, and the spectral index. To look for more than one significant source, we first conduct a targeted search, which is essentially a blind search, but at distinct positions where sources are likely to be found instead of at the observation center with a narrower range. So the sources suggested by the analysis with the blind search, we actually go to that position and do a narrower, more targeted search around that position to further certify if it's a significant source or not. So the hybrid search is a combination of blind and targeted search. It is necessitated to freely search for an additional source outside the shadow of a previously proposed or detected source. If a source from before, excuse me, is included in the model, has a high level of significance, which is judged by its log evidence, it can disproportionately influence the posterior of a new source, ending in a false positive detection. So a targeted search narrows down the range of an earlier source to scale down its impact on a subsequent search, which is being blind searched over the entire field of view of the map. So we have taken the first source into account, and then are there any additional sources? So before we worked on observations, we analyzed some simulations to check if we can recover input cluster and source parameter values by the means of our MAC-ADAM analysis. Simulation sets were prepared by replacing data points with the Gaussian noise acquired from the RMS values of the data set the simulation is based on. So here 5N is dataset 5. So the entire observational data we are working with has 10 data sets. So this is dataset 5 in that. So 5N is dataset 5 minus the data points plus the thermal noise, as I talked here. 5NC is 5N plus a cluster added to the simulation. SE1 is 5N plus a source environment 1. So it's a single source added to the map. SE1C is 5SE1 plus a cluster. NCSC is 5NC plus source confusion realization. So these are realistic population of sources underneath the noise threshold of the map. So it slightly pushes the noise level up compared to the other simulations. 10 different realizations of source populations were made for each cluster simulation based on datasets 2 and 5. This can train us to account for, at least in a statistical sense, the effect of a multitude of such sources that lie beneath the noise threshold in our observation. So since they're below the noise threshold, these sources cannot be detected by our analysis. But how does the statistics of dozens or hundreds of such sources affect even cluster detection? Or say there is another source which is above the noise threshold of the map, does this affect that? So to get an idea about that, we ran these simulations. So similarly, there was a source environment 2, which was added. So 5SE2 and 5SE2C are based on that. And these are the 10 different NCSC realizations. We did the same for dataset 2 simulations. So, but source environments 2SE1 and 5SE1 are not the same. So all these simulations are distinct. So here's a catch that these simulations were made of the correct set of parameter values, whereas these simulations were made by an incorrect set of parameter values, deliberately to test to what extent the MAC-ADAM analysis we have done works. So in the simulations with incorrect source parameters, the source was placed on a noise bump, which is a position on the map with a high fluctuation in noise. So it will affect its its flux density and inadvertently either give us a false negative or false positive of the source, and it is also off center. So the further the data points are from the center of the beam, the less weight those data points are, because the highest intensity is at the center of the map. So using these, we sort of had these incorrect source parameters, although we actually put a source in the map. So here are the continuum map. So here on the left, we have the continuum map of pure noise simulation, 5N. On the left, compared to its counterpart that also contains a cluster and a point source, 5SE2C on the right. So here are the noise levels of these simulations. C stands for continuum. Noise levels in 5NCSE series largely follow the same trend as above. So we'll see how to read these log evidence tables. So 5SE1C, so yeah, 5SE1C, these simulations had the correct source parameters. No, this had the incorrect source parameters, sorry. So the source should not be detectable by our analysis, but the cluster is. So 5SE1C is the first cluster run, which has the log evidence value of 4036 point something. And this is the null run, which is 4022. So the difference between them will give us the strength of cluster detection, which is around 14 here. So this equation, so log evidence difference between 5SE1C and 5SE1CN, the null run, shows that the model with the cluster is 10 raised to 13.7 times more favored than the model which does not have the cluster. So the cluster is detected here. Then to check for a source in the map, we take the difference between the one source blind search and the first cluster run. So here, this difference is 0.579, which is less than our threshold of 1. So even if MacAdam is suggesting a source here, it is low significance. So it will be rejected. Then we carried out one source targeted search on. So if the first source is not determined, there's no point in actually trying to see look for more sources. But here I'm demonstrating how we worked with this analysis. So here the log evidence difference between one source targeted search and one source blind search is around 2.1, which is above our threshold of 1. So this may lead one to think that one source targeted search validates the detection of the source invalidated by one source blind search right before. Targeted search has tighter prior bounds than blind search, forcing it to survey a smaller prior volume, thereby shooting up the prior probability and hence inducing a higher evidence value. So the baselines are not the same here. It is done to aid our hybrid search, which comes later on. So for to look for an additional source, we look at the log evidence difference between S2T1B1 and T1, which is shown here, which is 0.17, which is even lesser than the earlier log evidence difference. So no second source was also found. Here. So doing the similar analysis, so 5C1, this did not have a cluster and source parameter and incorrect source parameters. So no cluster nor any sources were detected here. 5C2 series had the source inserted with the correct source parameter values. So the source was detected, and since the simulation did not have a cluster, no cluster was determined here. No additional sources are found. So the simulation had only one source, and only one source was recovered. 5C2C has correct source parameters and a cluster. So a cluster is detected as well as the first source, and no additional sources found. 5NC did not have any sources and only the cluster. So the cluster is detected and no sources are found here. For NCSE realizations, no sources were ever found, and the cluster was always detected. 5N is the pure noise simulation. So it neither had a cluster nor a source, and none of them were detected. Or McAdam didn't suggest any cluster or source. So this is the same table continued with the other NCSC realizations. For simulation, dataset 2 simulations, again, with the pure noise simulation, no cluster, no source. With noise plus cluster, the cluster is detected, no sources. Here, the two SE1 series had the source with correct parameters, while 2SE2 series didn't have the correct parameters. So the source is recovered in 2SE1 and 2SE1C, while not in 2SE2 and 2SE2C. And wherever there is a cluster, the cluster is recovered. However, with the NCSC realizations, not all of them actually successfully recovered the cluster we had put in the simulation. So you can see that 2 NCSC 0 did not have, could not find the cluster, whereas in 2 NCSC and 2 NCSC 1, the clusters were found. And here are the rest of the NCSC realizations. So some are there which could not find the cluster. So again, one of the takeaways is that no additional or spurious sources were detected here. So, however, the cluster detection was affected by the source population beneath the noise level. So, I mean, all of these, they had, so all of these simulations indicated, all the simulations that have the green tick indicated the presence of a cluster varying from very low, which is slightly less than 1 log evidence jump, to very high confidence, which is greater than 4, whereas others reported a decrement in the log evidence value. So compared to the null run, the first cluster run, the log evidence was even lesser. So here, those are represented by crosses, red crosses here. It could mean that the cluster recognition is barely marginal, and some source confusion realization combinations help in its detection while others suppress it. Now we'll look at some posterior distributions. X0 and Y0 are cluster centers. Theta sub s is the cluster radius. Y subtot was introduced before, which is the proxy for the electrons in the clusters, and the electrons are the proxy for the gas or plasma in the cluster. So we assume at least overall the charge is neutral of the cluster. So if there are electrons which are free, that means there are also positive ions or protons. So most of them are hydrogen, ionized hydrogen. And yeah, so the parameters with the subscript 1 are the source parameters. So S is flux density, alpha 1 is the spectral index of the source flux. In this figure, we have simulation 2 and posteriors, which was pure noise. So it had the first cluster run and the one source blind search. This is how posterior distribution of a map made purely of noise looks like. So here we have RA1 and DEC1, which are source positions, and the noise spikes. So there are lots of, so it's a very broad distribution here with lots of noise spikes appearing as potential sources. However, these are too many, but all of them low significant sources. So no real source was actually recovered from here. And these are all smooth. I mean, these are not localized clusters. So this is the entire range in which the sampling is being done, and the median or the mean of that we see a peak here. So it's there's no cluster localization seen. Now I'll show you how simulation with the cluster looks like. So here it's a very broad distribution, while there is a cluster localization seen here. However, to SE2C series, while having the cluster, it had incorrect source parameters, so the source should not be recoverable. Black lines and stars are the true input values of the parameter in the plot. So these are the parameters we input in the simulations, while the distributions are what we get as an outcome of the analysis. So the darker shade is the 68% or 1 sigma confidence interval, while the lighter shade is 2 sigma confidence interval. So here, for expectation, the true values of source have not been recovered. As you see, the source parameters are on the edge of the distributions that we have got. So they were not accurately found, and whatever was found was also low significance. Now we have 2SE1C, which has the correct source parameters and the cluster. So all source parameters are tightly constrained. As you can see, even the distribution is sort of masked by the star here. So the source has been recovered well. Now we try to look at how different 2NCSC realizations gave us different results, such as here we have the first cluster run and the null run log evidence difference of 2NCSC7 simulation, which is around 7.04. I mean, so it's well above our threshold of 1. So the cluster is detected here and it's in red. So you can see the cluster is very well localized, whereas in 2NCSC8, it has a negative log evidence jump. So a cluster is not at all favored, and it can be seen with the broad distribution. Even if you look at y-tot, the 2NCSC7, it is showing that there is some gas which actually falls exponentially from the center of the cluster to the boundary, whereas there is hardly any gas detected for 2NCSC8. And it is actually the electrons in the cluster which make it detectable. Yes, the source in 5SE2C was ascertained, but how accurate was it? So positions of the sources, which we denote with P1, were noted from the maximum a posteriori parameters of the one source blind search stats.dat files of these simulations, and compared to the true source positions. So we calculated the separation delta P between the corresponding source position suggested by McAdam and the true source position input by us. So for 5SE1 series, the source recovered was 44 arc seconds off from its true position, while with the correct source parameters, it was recovered within 2 arc second accuracy. So this is the beam size to give you an idea of how it is well within the resolution of the map. Clearly, the sources were recovered with a high degree of accuracy in 5SE2 and 5SE2C, unlike in 5SE1 and 5SE1C, showing the promise of McAdam analysis. Similarly, for dataset 2 simulations, for 2SE1 series, they were recovered with around 1 arc second of accuracy, while the ones with incorrect source parameters were off by over 100 arc seconds. This is the beam size for this dataset. So I'll stop here. I'll pause here for a moment if anyone has any questions till this point.
So I don't see any questions in the chat yet. So if people want to ask directly, they can unmute or put it in the chat.
Looks like there are no questions. So shall I proceed?
Yeah, I think you can proceed.
So another aspect of our work was to study the effect of noise levels in these analyses. Noise levels are directly used in reweighting UV-FITS files and as a base in source searches in McAdam analysis. Hence, noise shapes the outcomes of McAdam analysis, predominantly source hunts, making it imperative to probe it. We qualitatively and quantitatively studied the effect of noise by tweaking their values by known amounts and documenting the impact of these changes. The noise in the data itself was not altered, but the weights were changed to make McAdam perceive the data as more or less noisy than it actually is. So the actual data points were left untouched, but the noise level assigned to it, what we feed to McAdam, that was altered. And with this presumption of that this map has this much noise, how it affects the MAC-ADAM analysis. That's what we studied. So LA is short for less accurate, MA is short for more accurate here. We have systematically investigated the effect of noise as we know what to expect from simulated data when correctly examined. More accurate analysis of simulation 5SE2C done before is juxtaposed with the less accurate analysis done here. First, we'll see how a 10% change in noise levels shapes the result of simulation 5SE2C's MAC-ADAM analysis, where we know the actual values of the source positions and cluster parameters in the form of log evidences and posterior distributions. So area 10I stands for 10% uniform increase in all noise levels from the true figures or values. 10D is 10% decrease in the same. These are the noise levels. So these are the original more accurate noise levels, while these are with the 10% increase and 10% decrease. So these are the log evidence tables. So for cluster detection, we look at the difference between row 1 and row 2. And for more accurate analysis, we have 4025 minus 4015, which is around 10. So the cluster is recovered and it's very good significance. For 10% increase in noise, the log evidence difference is around 7, which is lesser than 10, but still well above our threshold of 1. So the cluster is again recovered. For here, it is between 3803 and 7. So it's a difference of around 13. So again, the cluster detection is very high. And however, the log evidence difference is higher than even more accurate and 10% increase, which is 13 here. For the first source, so all these simulations have one source with the correct source parameter values inserted in that. So it should be recoverable. As we see here, B1 minus C, it's around 8. So the cluster is recovered. For 71, 65, again an increase of 6. And 15 and 3, a jump of 12. So the first source is determined in all of these. However, again, the detection significance is slightly lesser with the increase in noise levels, and it's slightly higher with the decrease in noise levels. For looking for a second source, we look at the log evidence difference between one source target search and two sources hybrid search. So it's 4038. Okay, so it's an increase of around 0.2, which is below our threshold of 1. So no source is detected here. Similarly, here it's a jump of 0.1, again not significant. Here it's a jump of almost 1.1. So a second source has been identified in this map, while the simulation only had one source. So this is a spurious source. Looking for a third source, as we didn't find a second, there again we don't expect to find a third source in these two at least, and which is what we get. It's an increase of 0.1.7 almost here, which is below 1. And here actually the log evidence drops by around 0.3. So no no more sources here. However, here it's an increase with the 10% decrease. The log evidence jump is of around 1.5, which makes it a third source has been found here. So a 10% uniform rise in noise does not affect the outcomes of MAC-ADAM analysis with respect to more accurate noise, but a 10% uniform drop in noise gives rise to spurious sources. 2 have been spotted so far. There may be more, but we didn't look for them because those are anyways spurious. Now we'll see how a 20% change looks like. So here is the more accurate analysis. This column is for cluster detection. These are the number of sources found. First, we'll see how the sources pan out. So more accurate, only one source, as we've seen before. And with 20% increase in noise levels, also only one source was found. With 20% decrease in noise levels, at least 3 sources were found. So at least 2 of them are extraneous sources. With cluster detection, all of these are well above 1, so the cluster is recovered. However, with 20% increase, the cluster detection confidence drops further to 5.44, while a 20% decrease in noise levels sees an increase in the cluster detection significance, which is around 17.8 here. So even a 20% hike in noise does not make the cut in suggesting pseudo sources, whereas a 20% dip in noise adds pseudo sources with accompanied log evidence, like added log evidence for cluster detection and with sources. So now let us see how varying the noise exclusively in one spectral window, keeping everything else, all other spectral windows constant, intact, affect the overall result. So here we have 120i means spectral window 1 noise was raised by 20%, and 120d means spectral window 1 noise was slashed by 20%. So all these noise levels are same, while the one in bold is showing the change in noise level in spectral window 1. So here we have the more accurate analysis with the same 9.49 and one source found, whereas with 20% increase in spectral window 1, one source is found, while 20% decrease in spectral window 1, at least 3 sources are found, which is like consistent with our earlier results. With the cluster detection, so first I'll show you, so these are rows 4 and 5 are 10% change in spectral window 2 noise levels. So this is 10% increase here with one source found, only one source found, while with 10% decrease in spectral window 2 noise levels, around 2 sources are found, the second source being marginally preferred. So the log evidence jump is slightly less than 1. So it's not strictly significant. Now we'll look at the cluster detection significance. So with the more accurate analysis, we see that it's here, and with 20% increase compared to the more accurate, it drops by around 1.5, while with 20% decrease in spectral window 1 noise, the cluster detection significance is higher, which is 13.61 compared to 9.49. Again, the trend is conserved here. With 10% increase, it drops from 9.49 to 9.04, while it marginally increases from 9.49 to 9.97 for a 10% decrease. So you can see that these are converging to a 0% change in noise, which is the more accurate analysis. So the cluster and the first source originally input in the simulation were confirmed in every situation. McAdam analysis is robust for cluster detection and does not miss existing sources we expect to find within a generous percentage error of 20%. Although it runs the risk of returning false positives when hunting for sources, there is an asymmetry in response to deviation in noise. It gives the impression that McAdam permits the noise to be understated by up to 10% and overstated by at least 20%. Upon carefully going through all the log evidence tables in the section, one can deduce that the log evidence jump for cluster detection in maps with overestimated noise is always lower than that of underestimated noise. Granted that it does not nullify a cluster identified by a more accurate run. So cluster is always detected, however, the strength of the detection changes. So why is this happening? So we believe in the course of reweighting the UV-FITS files, so the spectral window associated with a higher noise is downweighted, and the one with a lower noise is upweighted in relative terms. In essence, it downweights noisier data, which sounds logical to extract meaningful information from the data. In essence, so assigning a reduced noise level to a map upweights its data points along with the noise fluctuations in it. Perhaps the algorithm notices these spikes in noise as seemingly genuine sources against the backdrop of a lowered background noise. Now I'll come to observations. So these are the individual spectral window maps of dataset 1. You can see one bright source appearing in these 2 spectral windows and this one as well, with an additional source to the southwest of it. In spectral window 3, these sources are not found, and these sources are not seemingly visible, while another source is seen here. So how many of these are actually significant? We find that searches validate exactly one source, but no cluster in this data set. So here we have the continuum map of dataset 1 on the top versus the point source subtracted map of the same. So the square denotes the galaxy cluster, and the cross denotes the position of the subtracted source. So the foreground source, let us call it P1, appears to overpower the Sunyaev-Zel'dovich decrement from the cluster, if there's any. So because they are almost on top of each other. So the Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect is a decrement in this frequency range, while the source is a positive flux. So it may be canceling out, and the source is so powerful that its flux density is still reaching us, while the cluster, if there is any, we can't find it. So the cluster is non-significant here because its log evidence jump was less than 1. Now, these are the sources actually suggested by McAdam, but we need to be able to see if these are real sources. We have to look at existing catalogs. So Vizier is a common access point for most astronomical catalogs, where we can look for, okay, at this position with these source parameters, are we able to find a source? So the closest catalog source, the closest match we found to this suggested source in Vizier, let us call it C1, was found in this reference. So the distance between P1 and C1 is 2.288 arc seconds. The beam size for this data set is this. So it is well within the resolution of the map. So we think that we have actually identified a real known source. So that can help us in further seeing if a cluster is present or not. With datasets 2 and 5, we found at least one cluster in dataset 2, while we found one cluster in dataset 5, and no sources were found in these datasets. So again, but dataset 5 cluster was very significant because it had a log evidence jump of 6.65. So here we have continuum maps of dataset 2 on the left and dataset 5 on the right. So this dark blue black region is the cluster. So it's a negative decrement. And this is also the cluster position given to us by McAdam. So this is the original observational map, and this is the cluster. While this may appear as a bright source, our analysis did not find any significant sources in this map. So I'll summarize my work. Modeling the mass distribution of galaxy clusters is pivotal to understand the mass accretion history of the universe, since they are the most massive gravitating objects ever discovered. The Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect is instrumental in determining clusters of galaxies and their specific bulk properties from fluctuations in the omnipresent cosmic microwave background radiation. However, these fluctuations occur approximately in 1 part out of a million, making it extremely challenging for existing observational tools to directly uncover these structures and discern their properties from the omnipresent noise. Amongst a host of challenges, foreground and background sources pose a direct obstacle in identifying clusters of galaxies. In this project, with the implementation of a Bayesian approach in simulations and observations, we convincingly determine clusters and the sources that potentially obstruct them, thereby enhancing the strength of cluster detection. This preliminary modeling can be extended to probe the astrophysics of galaxy clusters. Say you assume hydrostatic equilibrium and actually link physical parameters to the GNFW model or the profile. Another aspect of this project is our study of the effect varying noise levels assigned to maps has on finding clusters and sources. We conclude that source detection is objectively more sensitive to a decrease in noise levels than to an increase in the same, while cluster detection improves with lower noise levels and vice versa. This warrants further investigation into how noise is determined from visibilities. So I'll again stop here for questions regarding this part of the talk, the fifth project.
So people, y'all can unmute or put it in the chat box. So yeah, I wanted to ask. So, do you like see? So this would cause a energy change in the CMB photons when it passes through the cluster and reaches us, right?
Yes.
So, do you see it in the famous map CMB maps which are there, the anisotropy maps or something,
So
the
these are,
fluctuations
yes, yes.
ones?
So these are actually seen from, so even Planck observations, though they are not very highly resolved, they also show these fluctuations. It's a second order fluctuation. So, but these are again one part out of a million. So these fluctuations. So you have to exaggerate these fluctuations by orders of magnitude to make it visible on the map. So yes, these are seen. These are not only seen with these are seen with the CMB, and even in so when you actually look at the CMB from gravitational lensing, even there you can see the effect of Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect causing fluctuations. And there are other first order anisotropies as well.
So if you look at a galaxy cluster and then you see look at it in radio, and so you will see the energy change.
Yes, it will be. So if you are sure, so if with optical analysis, say optical observation, say gravitational lensing, you have found a cluster and you're sure that there is a cluster there, and then you look at the CMB data in that direction, and you can actually do a cross referencing studies that, okay, what are the mass or size of the cluster that I get from gravitational lensing and from Sunyaev-Zel'dovich effect led distortion or fluctuations in the CMB, and you can actually match and sort of do a coupled analysis to further get robust parameters of these clusters.
Thanks. Does anyone have any questions? So you will have slides after this for your projects, right?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
Oh, so these are the references I used in this talk, and this is my acknowledgement. So in 2019, I did a summer project on materials in crackle pattern and unidirectional strain sensors. I was supervised by Professor Giridhar Kulkarni at JNCSR and SENS in Bangalore. So I'll very briefly describe what I did. Is the screen still visible?
Yep.
Okay. So when there is a drought, you may have seen that the soil cracks open, like there are all these random cracks in the soil. So similarly, you can form cracks in materials in the lab. So what we did was we took a crackle precursor suspension. A lot of these ingredients are actually also found in a regular nail polish, but barring composition and other things. So when you actually dry this crackle precursor suspension that you have to prepare with sonication and like a very well mixed suspension you have to get, and then you dry it, say you keep it on a petri dish or even a silicon or glass slide substrate, and cracks are formed, and these are random cracks. However, if you tilt the substrate and drop the crackle precursor suspension here, in very hand waving terms, I'll tell you that so the flow of water due to gravity and the evaporation, so this competition between the drying fronts actually leads to formation of parallel cracks. So these cracks are actually perpendicular to the flow of the water from that inclination. So you can see it here. So this is where the water has flown, and these are the cracks. This was done on a glass slide. So you also heat it, and there are other parameters you can vary, such as the angle of inclination, at what temperature we are heating to form these cracks, and optimize it to get the repetition of the cracks and the crack width, the spacing, all these things. And so we also did it on the silicon wafer as the substrate, and here is it's a microscope image. Then what we did was so you add a metal. So with the help of HAuCl4 and HF, you actually we deposited gold in these cracks. And then with CHCl3, which is chloroform, we actually wash the template which was used to make these cracks, the crackle precursor, the suspension. The water has dried out, so it dissolves in CHCl3, and what is left is a it's a wire mesh, a gold wire mesh, which is shown here. Then what we do is, so PDMS is short for polydimethyl siloxane. It's an elastomer, which at higher temperatures, it's actually liquid, but you can actually cure it at room temperature. So you mix it with a curing agent and add it to this wire mesh, and then you bake it. And after 7-8 hours, if you take it, or say next morning, and you peel off the silicon wafer, since the gold wire mesh has more affinity to PDMS, it actually sticks to the PDMS membrane while the silicon wafer is peeled out. So now we have essentially transferred the gold from the gold wire mesh from the silicon wafer to the PDMS. So the PDMS is it's an elastic membrane, while the metal wire mesh or the network is actually conducting. So you can use it as a strain sensor. So if I take this device or sensor and place it on my wrist, and say I've released my palm, and then I close it to make a fist, so the skin here actually stretches. So if I've placed the PDMS side below and the gold wire mesh above, and you have added, I've added also contacts to measure the conduction or resistance in this device. So as I actually stretch the PDMS membrane, so okay, I'll first say how we calibrate it. So we actually, you can calibrate the stress and strain measurements of the PDMS, and you can see the rise and fall in its resistance. So when the PDMS gets stretched, so gaps appear in the network, which actually shoots up the resistance. So these are actually nanometer level gaps. So conduction of electricity still happens, but it's due to tunneling, electron tunneling, and not your standard copper wire electricity. So that is there. So we actually work with resistance measurements here. So as we stretch it, the conduction drops and the resistance shoots up. And when you calibrate these with different, and when you release the membrane, it actually comes back and the resistance drops. So with this, you can actually find a one-to-one relation between how the resistance and the stress or the strain in the membrane are dependent on each other. And then when I do this exercise of, say, stretching my wrist, it's the back of my palm, not the wrist, sorry. Then in this direction, if I put contacts, and the stretching has happened in all directions, so this, the difference or the rise and fall in the resistance values actually gives me how much my skin actually spread in this direction and got back when I opened my fist. Cool. So this is what I did my summer in 2019. And so in 2018, I attended a few schools. First, I attended the introductory summer school in astronomy and astrophysics at the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics in Pune. There, I got a glimpse into nearly all aspects of astronomy and astrophysics research from the faculty at IUCAA and NCRA. Soon after, I attended a physics of life monsoon school at the National Center for Biological Sciences in Bangalore, where I got to learn how physics is used to study living systems, from cellular mechanics to ecological modeling. And in December, I attended a winter school on differential equations at Savitribai Phule, Pune University. So here I learned from ordinary differential equations to partial differential equations to the main attraction of the school, which was the fractional order differential equations. So you have first order derivatives, you have second order derivatives, but do you have a 1.5 you have 5th derivative or 3 by second derivative or 0.2th derivative. So this actually, these fractional order derivatives open up a new avenue to study systems, including physical systems. That so studying any dynamical system, the first thing you use are differential equations, and with this newer avenue, you can actually more accurately and more precisely study this system. So so that is what I did in 2018 outside of the semester. So yeah, and thank you. I mean, if you have any questions about this part, this very short section of my talk, please ask.
So yeah, I'll ask one thing. Yeah, so it seems that you've done quite different stuff. So it seems like you also did materials research and then you did astro. So how did you like decide what to do later on in your thesis or something?
Yes. So yeah. So in the summer, I was so in my second year, I got good exposure to astro, and I was interested in it. But when I had actually joined ICER, I thought I'll pursue a career in chemistry. So I actually tried different fields. So with my summer project, I tried to do a full-fledged project in. So it was at the interface of inorganic physical chemistry and condensed matter physics. So even during that summer, I attended an ICTS course by Professor Ganeshan Srinivasan on neutron stars and black holes, and he's an amazing lecturer. So that actually attracted me to astronomical research questions in astronomy. And then, so seventh semester, I also had a couple of courses, one by Professor Prasad Subramanian and one by Dr. Ramanathre, and enjoyed those courses a lot. And I had got some background baseline glimpse to all fields. So I started actually studying a little bit more about, okay, if I want to do experimental chemistry or experimental physics, what kind of questions I would be tackling, and in astronomy and astrophysics, what kind of questions will I be tackling, and so by December of my fourth year, so by the end of my fourth year, first semester, or what is that, seventh semester, I actually felt that questions in astro were more intriguing to me than in, say, chemistry. So I decided to switch, and I was actually studying what all kind of problems people are working on. So I thought I was more interested in more big materials than like gases and all than compact objects. So I moved to galaxy clusters, and I tried also like looking at interstellar medium. So these kind of projects I was looking at, and then that's where I did my fifth year in. Yeah, I mean, am I audible? Am I clear?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Yeah. So there are questions in the chat also. There's
Okay.
one question.
Any suggestions for applying to projects? Yeah, so one thing you should do is perhaps, so there are lots of fields in astronomy and astrophysics, from exoplanets to gravitational waves at all scales. So you have to actually spend some time in actually learning very introductory level stuff of these big areas, and then you will get to know towards what you have more affinity. And then when you have sort of decided, you can find relevant people who are actually working on these problems. So yeah, I mean, if you are doing astro projects in ICER, you will find only 2 or 3 faculty. So you'll have to look outside, and say, first start could be if you find people who are working on the problems you're interested in IUCAA or NCRA, you can reach out. So suggestions are like, first read up about things and see what you like and what kind of problems you want to contribute. It's not I'm not asking you to do any literature review, but sort of very broad introductory level understanding of what all is there, and then maybe you will have a better idea of what projects you can work on and where you can contribute, and then you can appropriately um, reach out to faculty stating what are your interests and with them what you want to do. So yeah. Oh yeah, so I want to do a PhD, but my applications were not successful, so I don't know when and how, when and where I'll be doing it. So I'll be more, if I'll be doing it, I'll be doing it in Astro. So my applications were in Astro only.
So how you process the data using Casa? So what steps you have involved in it, in Casa?
Yes,
Can
so CASA, I'll suggest you a very good resource. So NRAO is the National Radio Astronaut Observatory in the US. So they have all these compilations of these schools where they actually give, so they have recorded lectures and various documents how to use CASA for this. So you should Google it and look it up. So that will be a very good first level course on CASA, I'll say. And there are other CASA tutorial web pages also maintained by NRAO. So that's a good first place to try and learn how CASA works, what you can do, and what all sort of things you have to worry about when you're doing this.
Yeah,
So,
I'm asking. So what you use for your project?
yeah, I use CASA. So there are
what tasks?
Tasks are so clean tasks, then the split task. So you have to reduce the data. So there are all these physical calibrators, say Neptune, Jupiter, all these known archived astronomical sources which are used to calibrate what your new observations, the parameter values are. So you actually use the split task to remove all these calibrators and focus on the science field and spectral windows. And then, so these are all done in measurement sets. It is not a very efficient data structure to work with, but it has, but you can do all these tasks in CASA with that. And then to study it further, all this analysis was actually done in the UV plane, which is the plane in which the antenna actually make these observations. So I convert it to the UV FITS format, which FITS is flexible image transport system. And then you work with these files and you bin them to save on memory and other requirements, computation time requirements. So if you're working on a project, as and when you will know what tasks to use, and of course your supervisor will guide you on, like, if it is your first Astro project. So my project was my first full-fledged Astro project. So a lot of back and forth will be required if you're doing it for the first time on how to use certain things and what to do with that. But yeah, you will. There are a catalog of tasks and being developed with newer CASA versions. So we'll find that.
So you got data. That data was open, or like you are get.
So ALMA data. So it's on the ALMA website. So it's the ALMA request handler. You will find those with the correct project code. So yeah, first you'll have to find which project codes are for extragalactic and for our galactic observations. But my supervisor knew what data set we'll be working on. So that was, I didn't have to search for any data. These are the set of data sets I'll be working with. So they're just done it. These are all, most astronomical data sets are open source, especially on these big telescopes. Yeah, thank you. And there are some more questions. How much do you think GPA matters in project app? So project applications, they do matter. You have to mention it. But for PhD, it matters a lot more than, say, project applications. In project applications, you should have a clear idea on what you want to work on. And I think the overall number of your GPA does not matter, but individual courses, what you have done. So, for example, some PhD programs actually got back to me telling me that they were concerned, the admissions committee was concerned with my C and D grades in core physics courses. So no one really mentioned that, okay, your CGPA is low, but if you're trying to do a PhD in a field and try to do well in perhaps the core courses of that field. So they look at the courses you have taken and how you have done well. So if you are going to do it in biology and you have, say, got a D, few Ds in math, I don't think they'll care about it that much. But if you're doing in bio or in physics some basic physics courses, or all these specific courses or the courses of your topic of your PhD study that you're proposing to do, they should be good. And so I think they look at those, then the total number or the final what out of 10 you have, but individual grades in these courses. Yeah, thank you for the best of luck. Any more questions?
So can you share your MS thesis, if possible, like if you have completed the work that you are doing?
Oh, so it's actually, you can find it on the ISAR library. So there is this link.
Okay.
So there is called Digital Repository, which I don't have the link at the moment. So you can actually, so there they have there we upload the publications, or maybe, so it's actually under embargo, but you're an ISAR student, so you can get, I'll actually find the link, just a second. Well, so DR, I should see DR. I'll have to look in my mail. I'll share the link. So from there you can actually get, I don't know how ethical for it so it's a 2-year embargo, so I don't know if I can freely share a copy, but you can actually download it from the ISAR digital repository. So I can share it over email.
Okay.
So, look, if you have time and you have a strong dedication, you can do some projects in 3rd and 4th year. So yeah, so this is being recorded, but okay. So in my 5th semester, I actually had started a project in IUCAA, but within a few weeks, I had too many things on my plate, so I had to discontinue it. I couldn't continue the project, and then I've not done any semester project. But many people do, and to do justice to a SEM project, spend considerable amount of time outside coursework. So if you can get enough experience in your summers, in the semesters, but if you really, so yeah, if you are really interested in a topic that ISAR faculty work on, so yeah, definitely try doing a project. However, if project supervisor is not so easily accessible, doing all these to and fro traveling to IUCAA or NCRA, discussing projects, it will be time consuming. So you should decide on that. So if you have already decided in your 3rd year what you want to do, it is. So you can actually talk about your experience. So if you've tried different projects, it actually gives you a better breadth in further focusing on what you want to do, a 5th year project, or if you want to do PhD, whatever. So yeah, it's dependent on you. I mean, I can't say because I did not do any project. Like I started, but I have to leave because I couldn't give time. So yeah. Oh, so the courses I had, so it was not due to the coursework. I had some 25 credits or 24 credits as actually the general coordinator of Caravan. So that took up my time. I couldn't give to the project. So yeah, that was it.
So, does anyone have any questions? Because it's already been 1 hour, 15 minutes or something. So maybe I can stop recording then. So yeah, thanks a lot for the talk.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to give this talk.
Yeah.
Akash.
I'll stop recording.